Hello, welcome back to our study of Leviticus. This is our fourth session and our last. So we'll be looking at from chapter 21 to the end of Leviticus. So this is where we're at. God, who is holy, has called these people, the Israelites, into a relationship with him. They are in covenant relationship with him. And this is by God's grace. They don't deserve to be in this relationship, but because he is a loving and gracious God, he has brought it to be. But because he's holy, that means that they also need to be holy. And that's what the latter part of these chapters, the latter part of Leviticus does. It speaks to ways in which God has provided for them to remember who they are and that they are called to holiness. So, for example, there are special days that they're supposed to remember. Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and others that we'll talk about. And on these days, they give thanks and they remember again who they are and who God is, and that he is a holy God. Also, he talks about here in these final passages about rewards and punishments. Rewards, if you're obedient, God says to these people, I will reward you. But also, if you're not obedient, then I will punish you. So we're going to talk about that. And as well, he gives them that mandate, which should affect all of their relationships, which is very important. And that mandate is love your neighbor as yourself. So these are three different ways then that God helps these people to live out holy lives as he wants them to and expects them to. But first, this passage that we're going to be dealing with has to do with priests, because priests have a special role in this whole covenant relationship. They act as a go-between between the people and God. So this first chapter here, chapter 21 then, speaks about priests, and it tells us that because priests have this special role where they offer sacrifice on behalf of the people, and they also teach the people, that one of the things that they are limited in is their rights and in terms of who they can mourn for. Look at this, verse 21, chapter 21. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them, a priest must not make himself ceremonially unclean for any of his people who die, except for a close relative such as his mother or father, his son or daughter, his brother, or an unmarried sister who is dependent on him since she has no husband, for he may make himself unclean. He must not make himself unclean for people related to him by marriage and so defile himself. People die. And the priest may be touching these people or in contact with them. And so that would make him ceremonially unclean. Death makes somebody ceremonially unclean, a corpse. And a priest must keep away from that. But he is allowed to have that contact if it is somebody close to him, But otherwise, no, and he's going to guard himself. He also has to be very careful about who he marries. Verse 7, they must not marry women defiled by prostitution or divorced from their husbands, because priests are holy to their God. Regard them as holy because they offer up the food of your God. Consider them holy because I, the Lord, am holy. I make you holy. You see that word holy many times because priests are to be holy, set apart. They need to be very careful about who they marry. So they need to be very careful about who they touch in terms of being a dead body and being in contact with, and also who they marry. And the high priest needs to be especially careful on these points. This is what it says in verse 10. The high priest, the one among his brothers who has the anointing oil poured on his head and who has been ordained to wear the priestly garments, remember those elaborate priestly garments, must not let his hair become unkempt or tear his clothes. He must not enter a place where there is a dead body. He must not make himself unclean even for his father or mother. The priest could, but not the high priest. Nor leave the sanctuary of his God or desecrate it, because he has been dedicated by the anointing oil of his God. I am the Lord. And the high priest has to be especially careful of who he marries, even more than the priest. Verse 13, the woman he marries must be a virgin. He must not marry a widow, a divorced woman, or a woman defiled by prostitution, but only a virgin from his own people. So he will not defile his offspring among his people. I am the Lord who makes them holy. So the priest has to be very careful about touching dead bodies, about who he marries. A high priest, even more so. Even his mother and father, he can't be touching if they die. And he has to marry a virgin. And people who have physical limitations cannot be priests. Verse 16, the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, for the generations to come, none of your descendants who has a defect may come near to offer the food of his God. No man who has any defect may come near. No man who is blind or lame, disfigured or deformed, no man with a crippled foot or hand, or who is hunchbacked or dwarfed, or who has an eye defect, or who has festering or running sores, or damaged testicles. No descendant of Aaron, the priest, who has any defect, is to come near to present the offerings made to the Lord by fire. He has a defect, he must not come near to offer the food of his God. He must eat the most holy food of his God as well as the holy food, yet because of his defect, he must not go near the curtain or approach the altar and so desecrate my sanctuary. I am the Lord who makes them holy. So priests that have some sort of physical defect can eat the holy food, the food that's that part of the offering that's meant for the priest, but he's not allowed to make the offering. Talk some more in this next chapter about the sacred offerings and the food, how that food can be eaten. It says, chapter 22, tell Aaron and his sons to treat with respect the sacred offerings the Israelites consecrate to me, so they will not profane my holy name. I am the Lord. We're talking about the animal offerings. Remember, part of it is burnt in these offerings, but another part of it is given to the priest to eat. This talks about it. If a descendant of Aaron has an infectious skin disease or a bodily discharge, he may not eat the sacred offerings until he is cleansed. He will also be unclean if he touches something defiled by a corpse or by anyone who has an emission of semen, or if he touches any crawling thing and makes him unclean, or any person who makes him unclean, whatever the uncleanness may be. So if a priest is unclean by any of these things, he's not to eat the sacred offerings. The one who touches any such thing will be unclean till evening. He must not eat any of the sacred offerings unless he has bathed himself with water. When the sun goes down, the end of the day, he will be clean, and after that he will eat the sacred offerings, for they are his food. He must not eat anything found dead or torn by wild animals, and so become unclean through it. I am the Lord. The priests are to keep my requirements so that they do not become guilty and die for treating them with contempt. I am the Lord who makes them holy. The priest offered sacrifices on behalf of the people. These were animals. That part of the animal was burnt, was offered to the Lord. The other part was to be eaten by the priest. This was part of how they were provided for, was by this. But if the priest was unclean by any of these ways that we just mentioned, then the priest could not eat at that moment. He had to wait until the end of the day until he was cleansed, and then he could eat the offering. Because this was his food. He had to have some, this was the food that was meant for him. In chapter 23, the Lord helps these people to remember who they are and that he is holy, and to be thankful by providing certain days of the year and even weeks, feasts, by which they remember these various things. This is what it says in chapter 23. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed feasts, the appointed feasts of the Lord, which are to proclaim as sacred assemblies." And the first one really isn't an annual one, it's a weekly one. The Sabbath. There are 6 days when you are at work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work. Wherever you live, it is a Sabbath to the Lord. So this first one that is mentioned really isn't a special feast. It's a regular one. It's one that takes place every week. And that is every seventh day, the Israelites are not to work. They're to rest. This does something for their bodies, but it also gives them opportunity for assembly, to get together and to remember the Lord. What are the other ones? Well, it talks about, these are the ones that are listed, the Passover and the unleavened bread. At one time, these were separate, but they follow one another, and therefore, by Jesus' day, they were actually one celebration. The Passover remembered that quick exodus that the Israelites made out of Egypt, how they didn't even take time for their food to get prepared, but rather they quickly left Egypt, and God brought them out and rescued them from the bondage that were there in Egypt. And so this happened on Passover. Another celebration was called the first feast of first fruits. It was a harvest festival where they brought the first fruits of the harvest to the Lord. This is a way of thanking the Lord for the harvest that was about to come and to anticipate that harvest. Third one was the Feast of Weeks. This was 7 weeks or 50 days after Passover. And this was actually the people who were there on that Pentecost that we read about in Acts chapter 2. That's the Jewish people were there in Jerusalem. They were actually celebrating this Jewish festival, this Feast of Weeks, which later on became associated with the law that was given to Moses, remembering it. Then there's the Feast of Trumpets, which of course would involve the blowing of trumpets. The Day of Atonement was the fifth one. We talked about that before. The Day of Atonement was that one day during the year where the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies and make atonement for all the sins of the people that were committed during that year. And then the last one is the Feast of Tabernacles. Let's read about that. We see it in the last part of this chapter. This is what it says. On the first day of this Feast of Tabernacles, you are to take choice fruit from the trees and palm fronds, leafy branches, and poplars, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. Celebrate this as a festival to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. And when I was in Jerusalem, I saw some of these temporary shelters that people had made out of branches. They were in their last days, but they were there sitting on the sidewalks of Jerusalem. Live in the booths for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in booths, so your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in booths when I brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So this celebration, this Feast of Tabernacles, or booths if you like, where people were living in these temporary shelters, reminded these people of when they were living in the wilderness and in these temporary shelters there. So Moses announced to the Israelites the appointed feasts of the Lord. So during the course of the year, besides the Sabbath that happened every week, but during the course of the year, there were these festivals that God told the people to celebrate. Passover, First Fruits, Feast of Weeks, Feast of Tabernacles, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. And when they celebrated these various feasts during the year, what would happen is that there would be an expression of thanksgiving on their part for what God had done for them. They would be worshiping God, and they would be remembering how gracious God had been to them in how he treated them throughout the course of their history, bringing them out of bondage and then bringing them through the wilderness and into the promised land. In chapter 24, we meet this section on the oil and the bread that is in the holy place and which is to be maintained. This is what it says in chapter 24. The Lord said to Moses, "Command the Israelites to bring you clear oil of pressed olives for the light, so that the lamps may be kept burning continually. Outside the curtain of the testimony in the tent of meeting, Aaron is to tend the lamps before the Lord from evening till morning continually. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. The lamps on the pure gold lampstand before the Lord must be tended continually." I guess that word continually keeps coming up. Keep doing it. "Take fine flour and bake 12 loaves of bread using 2/10 of an ephah of each loaf. Set them in 2 rows, 6 in each row, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. Along each row put some pure incense as a memorial portion to represent the bread and to be an offering made to the Lord by fire. This bread is to be set out before the Lord regularly, Sabbath after Sabbath, on behalf of the Israelites as a lasting covenant. It belongs to Aaron and his sons, who are to eat it in a holy place, because it is a most holy part of their regular share of the offerings made to the Lord by fire." This passage of Scripture reminds us about the whole tabernacle and the way that it was organized. This tabernacle had a tent in it, a tent of meeting, and in the tent was a holy place and a most holy place, and then outside the tent in the courtyard was an altar and what was called a laver, a place to wash. So in the courtyard, you had two structures. You had the altar on which the sacrifices were made, the burnt offerings. Fire was, the animals were cut up, placed on the altar. Fire was there. They were burned. That's what the altar was about. The laver was a place where there was washing. There needed to be a lot of washing because there were a lot of animals that were being killed and people needed to be washed, cleansed. So that was outside. Then you had, in the innermost part, you had the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies, there was one piece of furniture, if you like, and that was the Ark of the Covenant. That was the place where the high priest would enter into once a year and manipulate the blood, spread the blood on the ark, making atonement for the sins of the people. And between the two, between the outer court and the Holy of Holies, but in the tent of meeting, was the holy place, the place where the priests would do their ministries. And in that section, there were three. There was the altar of incense. Incense was burned continually. And then the two that we're talking about right here. A lampstand. On that lampstand, obviously, there was candles, and that provided, at least one of the functions was to provide the light so that the priests could see what they were doing in that space. And on the other table were loaves of bread, 12 loaves of bread that needed to be continually replaced as they got older, I suppose. But those loaves of bread were meant for food for the priest. So this was the sanctuary. This was the place that God had given to the Israelites. It said, this is the place that I will meet with you, that I will meet with you. And then the Lord said, I'm bringing you into the land, and this land that I'm giving you, you know what? I'm giving it to you, but it's still my land, and it has to be treated in the right way. So one of the ways that this land needs to be treated in the promised land is that it needs to be given rest periodically. That's what the first part of chapter 25 talks about. The Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself, your manservant, maidservant, and hired worker, and temporary resident who live among you, as well as for your livestock and wild animals in your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten. So just as you Israelites, every 7th day are to stop working and rest, have a Sabbath rest, so also this land, which I am giving to you, it's to have a rest. And that is, every 7th year, this plot of land that you've been, for 6 years, you've been growing crops on that land. Well, on the 7th year, don't grow any crops. Don't sow and reap and harvest. Except that if by its own course, this land produces something, and probably would, because seeds would be in the ground. If something does grow up during the 7th year, yes, you're allowed to harvest it and to eat it. And also, people, I'm giving you this land. Everyone is to have their own portion. But there could be some unequalness that happens over the course of a period of time where people become more prosperous and other people become poorer, and maybe you even have to sell their land. Well, guess what? I want you to redistribute it every 50th year so that those poor people can get back the land that they had initially. Social justice is at stake here. The year of the Jubilee, verse 8. Count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbaths of years amount to a period of 49 years. So it's 7 times 7 is 49. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. Sound the trumpet throughout your land. Consecrate the 50th year. So the 50th year, every 50th year. Proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family property, and each to his own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the untended vines. In this year of Jubilee, everyone is to return to his own property, the property that was given to him when they entered the Promised Land. If you sell land to one of your countrymen or buy any from him, do not take advantage of each other. You are to buy from your countrymen on the basis of the number of years since the Jubilee, and he is to sell to you on the basis of the number of years left for the harvesting crops. When the years are many, you are to increase the price, and when the years are few, you are to decrease the price, because what he is really selling you is the number of crops. Do not take advantage of each other, but fear your God. I am the Lord your God. So on that 50th year, those who have purchased more land, because maybe they were better farmers, maybe they were smarter, whatever, they were able to purchase more lands. Those that were poor, for one reason or other, they had to pour their crops. So now you have a situation where you've got rich people with lots of land and poor people with little land. Well, on this 50th year, there needs to be a redistribution where the poor people can buy back the land that they sold, so that both can have the right amount of land, the land that they had when they entered the Promised Land. And when you sell back the land, God is saying, you must do it fairly. You must not take advantage of this person, but do it on the basis of the number of years that you have had the land. And this is the basis of it. Verse 23, the land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants. So God is saying, the basis on which I'm telling you to do this is really, in fact, this land that you're sitting on right now, and even may have your name on, it's my land, it's my property, but I've given it to you for use, and so I have a right to say how it should be used. So, we come then to the takeaways. What are they? Well, here's the first one. New Testament leaders, pastors, deacons, are called to high standards, just as the priests and the spiritual leaders of Israel were. We look at 1 Timothy chapter 3. We see that there are conditions, or there are ways in which the the pastors and deacons need to be very careful about how they live their lives. This is what it says in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Here is a trustworthy saying: if anyone sets his heart on being an overseer is another name for pastor in this case, he desires a noble task. Now the overseer must be above reproach, the husband of but one wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him with proper respect. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace. And then in verse 8 it talks about deacons. Deacons likewise are to be men worthy of respect. So we have these two. In the Old Testament we have priests. In the New Testament we have pastors and we have deacons. Priests were, they had a special role. All the Israelites were called to holiness, but the priests had to be, there were certain things that there were more restrictions upon them and the way that they were to live and conduct themselves. And so also pastors. Pastors are people who, like the people that they pastor, are sinners who need forgiveness. Having said that, they're to be very careful. They're to be very careful about their lives, how they present themselves to outsiders, and how they manage their own family. Secondly, the themes of grace, holiness, and obedience are prevalent in Leviticus. These three: grace, holiness, and obedience. We meet them time and time again. It is by God's grace that the Israelites were in the position that they found themselves. It was all by God's grace. They were no longer in bondage in Egypt. Why? Because God brought them out of Egypt. Why? Because he did. It was by his grace. It wasn't because they deserved to be brought out, but God did it anyway. They were in covenant relationship with him. He was their God. They were his people. What was the base of that covenant? Grace. God's grace. God made it happen. They were going to inhabit a land. They were in the wilderness, but they were headed for a land where it would flow with milk and honey. And it would be a wonderful place. And why would they get that place? Because of God's grace. They were his chosen people. He chose to do these things for them. He gave them feasts that they could remember on an annual basis, how gracious he had been to them. Secondly, the idea of holiness. That God had brought them to this place with whom they were in covenant. This God was a holy God. As they were sinful, and God's wrath goes out against sin, he gave them a sacrificial system whereby, in making offerings, their sins could be covered and they could continue in fellowship with him. Okay. He brought them out of Egypt. He brought them into a covenant relationship with him. He wants to have fellowship with himself. They want to have fellowship with God. But the problem is God is holy and these people are sinful. And the righteous response of a holy God concerning sin is that his wrath goes out against it. So how are these people going to maintain this ongoing relationship with him? The answer is through this sacrificial system, through the sacrificing of animals. These animals, their blood being shed in place of the blood of the sinners that are making these offerings. Does this blood really forgive sin? No, but it covers sin, so that by the blood, by the sin being covered, these people could stay in relationship with God and God with them. And then there's the matter of obedience. These people were meant to obey God. His holiness had a moral dimension, God's holiness, but also, as we're reading in Leviticus, a physical one. The moral code, and we read about the various moral imperatives, were directed by this major overseeing one, which was to love your neighbor as yourself. We saw that several times. That speaks to all the different. It's very important for God, in God's sight, that people treat other people in the right way. And so you could break it down and have 10 different commandments, if you like. But if you just think about that one, love your neighbor as yourself, that sort of covers it all. It covers it all. If you obey that, then you will be taking care of all the others. But there was also a physical dimension we saw in Leviticus to God's holiness, and that related to cleanness and uncleanness. There were certain physical things, people, part of the physical world, animals, if you like, also, some being clean, some being unclean. When you were clean, you could do certain things. When you were unclean, you couldn't. When you were unclean, you couldn't offer sacrifices, you couldn't eat food. We saw that a moment ago. So the people of Israel had to be very careful. They were always attentive about the physical world in which they lived in terms of what was clean and what was unclean. So then, what about us? What about New Testament believers like ourselves? Well, we need to say there is some commonality from what we learned in Leviticus. And that is that the whole basis of our relationship with God is on the basis of the relationship that the people of Israel had with God. And that is, it is by God's grace. Just like them, we are sinners. We deserve nothing from God except his wrath. But we have this right relationship with God because God has done something for us that we don't deserve. He has sent Jesus. And Jesus is not like an animal. He is the perfect Son of God who is without sin. Our sin is placed on him. He paid the penalty for our sin. And so when we repent and put our faith in Jesus, then we are in a right relationship with this holy God. And there's no need to offer any other sacrifice. This one perfect sacrifice has been made, and that is the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In terms of the moral code, yes. As believers, we still must do the same as they did. We must love our neighbors as ourselves. But what we don't need to do is we don't need to worry about what is clean and unclean. Was that important? Well, it was obviously important in the historical setting in which the Israelites were. God had a purpose in this, in designating some things as clean and some things as unclean. But that purpose now is no longer present, and so for we who are believers, our concern must be with the moral code of holiness, but not with the physical one, Well, I hope you have enjoyed the study of Leviticus. I certainly have, and I'm really glad we did it together. God be with you.